Do people do things that they know to be wrong? Or if you're doing something, is it always because you don't necessarily know it to be wrong?
I believe that I should act that way, but I am justified in not doing it.
Yo, what up? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I'm Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And this week we are finally going to be wrapping up our book club on G.A. Cohen's lecture series turned into a book, If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich? And this week he really kind of delves into that idea about what is the problem of being a rich egalitarian, if there is a problem. Is it problematic, or is there no contradiction there whatsoever? So we'll go ahead and wrap that up and maybe give some final thoughts, and we'll see where the conversation goes. And if we feel like it's not quite sufficiently covered, then maybe we'll do a wrap-up episode. Does that sound about right, Troy?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Okay, cool. But of course, before we get into that, we got to give a shout out to our sponsor for this episode. It is Mubi. That is Mubi, Mubi.com. Mubi, they are an online streaming service that specializes in like independent films and regional darlings. I'm moving away from calling them foreign films now. Even in my daily life, I'm checking myself, Troy. The regional specialties that you might not be as familiar with, or like old cinematic classics that you may have flown under the radar that you haven't seen in a long time, or that you've just always wanted to see. And every day they present a new film, and they're always on there for 30 days. So it's a 30-day rotation where a new film is added. It's on there for 30 days, and then another film drops off, and there are always 30 films at a time. So it's 30 perfectly curated films. So Troy's going to talk to you about a film that I know really tickles his fancy that is on the Mubi platform at this moment regionally in the United States. As I said, they do have different regional libraries, so go ahead and check your Mubi library today. But Troy, what's going on in America right now that's got you excited?
Yeah, for sure, man. Looks like one of the new movies on Mubi right now, available as a couple days ago, is Darren Aronofsky's first movie, Pi. You've seen this, right?
You know what, dude?
Or at least parts of it?
Yeah, I know for sure, because, sometimes I go through those. I need to catch up on, like, either the art house classics or the indie classics or whatever, and I'll have a binge week or something like that, or a couple weeks. And I'm pretty sure I tried, but I don't know if I finished it. It's black and white, right? Yeah, it's black and white. It's very obviously his first film in terms of the production value and whatnot, but it's fantastic. I mean, the plot is unlike anything you pretty much ever see. This guy is a famous mathematician, or at least he's a very successful mathematician, not famous or anything. And he somehow stumbles on some sort of solution to a mathematical problem which will change the world in some sense, although I think it's mysterious as to what it is. But then it becomes this like conspiracy thriller as he's pursued by various groups, including like a Hasidic Jewish cult, which is like into Kabbalah and stuff, and they think that the solution to this problem is something they can use, and also like Wall Street firms that want to use it for, I don't know, like financial algorithmic purposes. And it's so unique and original, and then beautifully shot, as all Aronofsky films are. And it's got the conspiracy thriller element to it too. So even if that's just what you're into, it'll get your adrenaline pumping. Huh. God, it does not sound familiar now that you're describing it, but I mean, I gotta love me some Darren Aronofsky. What's your favorite Aronofsky film?
I was gonna ask you that.
I'm a sucker for The Wrestler, man. Yeah, I'm a big sucker for The Wrestler.
I still haven't seen The Wrestler. I need to do that.
Oh, it's the best Jesus movie ever made.
I know, I heard you say that, and I want to watch it for that reason, but
yeah,
not the kind of thing you just automatically think about watching.
Oh man, I love it so much. It's because it's so stripped down. It's it's a lot of handheld camera just following Mickey Rourke around, and there's no special effects. There's not a lot of big staging, except for, there's some like wrestling scenes that are big, but yeah, it's fantastic. And this makes me now want to go watch Pi, because I have a feeling that he's budget constrained, and so it's going to be much less. It's not obviously going to be like fucking Noah or like even Mother, right? Or even like Black Swan, because he doesn't have the superstars and stuff like that with Pi. So I always like to see what a director does when they have budgetary restraints. They have to be a little bit more creative and resourceful.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely when some of the great directors are at their best, when they're, not given all the accoutrement that end up sometimes weighing them down.
Yeah, 100%. Well, sweet. Okay, so like I said earlier, this is on Mubi.com, and if you go to Mubi.com/owls@dawn, you will get a free 30-day extended trial with Mubi, so you can go check out Pi, or you can go see whatever else they got in their library. So go to Mubi.com/owls@dawn to get your free 30-day trial for them. And as my friend Ryan once said, we'll see you at the movies, which I think is fantastic, and they should take that and use that slogan.
And if you want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/owls@dawn. We have several different things that we offer right now for patrons. One is a monthly newsletter that has a bunch of extra sticky leaves and shitty minutes and all that kind of stuff in it, as well as some articles and other stuff that we've been reading lately. And you get access to bonus episodes for a certain tier as well. I think we just released a couple bonus episodes in the last couple of weeks, right? One of your chat with Andy Stewart, horror filmmaker and director, which I just listened to the other day, and I absolutely loved all the talk about horror movies and the philosophy of horror. And I definitely felt a connection with Andy as far as being a very kind of more neurotic person who is in no way engaged in the things that are involved in horror movies in their own life. But then horror itself becomes like this almost like safe way to interact with gore and body horror and stuff like that. I feel that. So I really connected with Andy on that bonus episode.
Yeah. Cool, man. Yeah. I'm glad. Yeah, go check that shit out. Go to patreon.com/owls@dawn, and you can find out how to get access to bonus episodes and all the other bonus content and shit. And, of course, we'll be doing the patron-led episode here in the next couple of weeks. We've got some guests lined up over the next few weeks as well, so we'll have to kind of weave it in and out of there, but we will be doing that as well, so you can look forward to that episode. But now, it's time to get started on the segment that is known as the Shitty Minute. This is where one of us gets to rant and rave about whatever it is that's pissing us off for the week. T-Roy, it's your turn. What is your shitty minute, brother?
All right, dude. So my shitty minute this week is based on, it's basically going to be about a movie I just saw, and which apparently is winning awards at the various American institutional circle jerks. So I just saw Bohemian Rhapsody. Have you seen it?
Oh, no, I have not, but I have a close friend who hates this fucking movie, so I'm really curious to see what you have to say.
Oh, it's awful, dude. It is so awful. So it didn't get great reviews. It got kind of mixed reviews, so I didn't see it in theaters because I like Queen, especially, Brian May, instrumentally, musicianship-wise, love him. Some of their stuff's a little bit, over the top, but generally, it's a band that I like. I didn't see it in theaters, though, because the reviews were kind of mixed and didn't have any desire to necessarily pay money to go see that in the big theaters. But then it won some awards, and I knew some people that saw it that loved it. So I thought, it'd be worth watching. And I really, really hated this movie.
Really?
Yeah, just in basically every single way possible. So just on the surface level, the movie is basically a Wikipedia. Like you can go on those web pages and click like the read page button or whatever.
Yeah.
So like some robot voice just comes over and reads the Wikipedia article to you. That was the movie, basically.
Okay.
So it's just boring from like a plot standpoint and all that. But also just I don't want to talk too much about this. Oh, you're probably not going to see this, but anyway.
Yeah, fuck it. I'm not going to. I don't care. Spoiler it. Spoilers. Yeah. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you don't want to hear spoilers, fast forward, but spoilers.
Hopefully you know what happens to Freddie Mercury at the end. If you don't, then what the hell?
Then read the Wikipedia page.
The movie's about Freddie Mercury. Like, it's not really about the band. Roger Taylor and Brian May and the other dude, I forget his name, are kind of just like side characters who don't do anything other than kind of, disapprove of Freddie Mercury, but then give him hugs later or whatever. It's really about him. And he is portrayed as like the least complex character in a movie, especially given the obvious complexity of Freddie Mercury, the person, from anybody that, kind of followed his story and all the things that happened to him and he dealt with. And he's basically just portrayed as this like flamboyantly kind of gay dude with bad teeth who never does anything wrong, but a bunch of bad things happen to him and bad people around him steer him the wrong way. And luckily he had bandmates that were so supportive and who happened to be executive producers of the film.
Right.
Or who knows what would have happened. There's this one character, I forget his name, but he's like the kind of the gay best friend and becomes like the confidant for Freddie Mercury that kind of leads him away. Basically the Yoko Ono character in the kind of classic narrative setup. And the movie basically ends up blaming everything that goes wrong with Queen on this guy, straight up Yoko Ono style. And then Freddie Mercury finally figures it out, kicks the guy out, and everything's fine again. But then he dies of AIDS. So yeah, it's clearly trying to make Freddie Mercury look as sympathetic as possible. Like this, if Freddie Mercury was still around, this would have been like his major PR move to get back in to like the public scene and release a solo album. But of course, he can't do that. So I'm sure Brian May and Roger Taylor are the ones that are benefiting from that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just comes off extremely dishonest and disingenuous and not at all interesting because, again, it's just like the Wikipedia version of it written from a very particular perspective. And it's such a shame because I'm sure, not knowing more than like the basics about Queen's history and Freddie Mercury as a person, the idea of like, always like Indian or Pakistani immigrant family living in America, being gay, trying to figure out his sexuality, all that kind of stuff could have been done in a super interesting way if it didn't have this need to just make him look like he was the good guy at all times and just happened to be led astray by the one wolf in sheep's clothing in his midst. But they refused to do that because they wanted to make the most palatable movie possible. And they're being rewarded with Best Picture nominations and awards. So, I guess that, they can shit all over our takes.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think it is? Do you think that like the Academy and Hollywood Foreign Press just have no taste? I mean, I think some people would say the Hollywood Foreign Press clearly has no taste, and they're just like being bribed and taken out to fancy dinners so they can hang out with celebrities. Maybe they just wanted to hang out with fucking Queen or something like that. I don't know. But like, what do you think it is? I don't understand. The two people that I trust their film sensibilities very highly have both said similar things, you and Keir. So like, what do you think it is about this film that is like overcoming what are clearly big, huge black eyes?
I'm confused, man. Like, yeah, sure, all the stuff about the Hollywood Foreign Press, I'm sure, is true, and it's all about who you know and exchanging favors and all that, not about artistic, representation or artistic value or any of that. But still, they usually pick at least a moderately good film, for Best Picture, and they don't have just like usually don't have random shit in there. I don't see how this is even like a really good film unless, I guess, like there's one part of the film that's the last 20 or so minutes, which is basically a shot-for-shot remake of the Live Aid concert in 1984 or 85 or whenever it was.
Right.
The whole thing where they made money for Africa and no one talks about Africa, just about the bands.
Right.
So they did basically like a shot-for-shot remake of like 15, 20 minutes of that concert, which a lot of people I know mentioned was like an amazing technical achievement and all that. But I was just like, maybe it's an amazing technical achievement, but who cares? Because if it's a shot-for-shot remake of the actual concert, go watch the concert.
Right. You can go see it on fucking YouTube right now.
Yeah, it's really easy to find. I don't get why that's in any way an artistic... It's like if I tried to make like a remake of me jumping from the free throw line to dunk, and I can't do it because I'm not Michael Jordan, but I use a trampoline and then I use a bunch of, digital enhancements to make it look like I'm actually doing it. And I'm wearing a, Bulls 23 jersey and I'm in blackface or whatever. And then I do the dunk. And it's like, well, okay, I guess you can make it look like you were Michael Jordan dunking, but I'd rather watch Michael Jordan dunking.
Yeah, how come we get mad at artistic counterfeiters, like art counterfeiters, but like this kind of reproduction is supposedly valorized,
Because it admits it up front, which somehow gives it value.
Yeah, I guess, huh? But it's like
Yeah, I
it's
didn't
like
get that.
someone's just doing an impersonation. Like, I don't know, biopics are always tough because we fuck when I say we, I mean like the film industry types. They fucking love biopics. Like when someone puts on a fat suit or loses weight or puts in fake teeth or shaves their head or puts on ugly makeup or something like that. For some reason, they like wet their pants. So everyone is freaking out, I think, because Rami Malek looks so much like Freddie Mercury and da da da. So people just they get caught up in these weird sort of sentimental and sensational aspects, and it
And
kind of
yet,
like
and yet,
covers.
cosplaying is looked down upon in culture.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's basically what it is. It is cosplay. It's fucking Queen cosplay.
And the worst part about biopics generally is if the person had a problematic life and you can't just sort of ignore that, then you have to basically make them look as sympathetic as possible. They can't be complex, right?
Yeah.
And then if they had a majority good life, like they did good things, then you basically have to make those things look like they changed the entire world and that they never did anything but be a saint.
And
Otherwise,
does this do both? Like it makes him look like he changed the world, and it makes him look like he's just not very complicated.
well, they luckily don't go so far as to say like Live Aid changed the world and now Africa's a paradise or something like that. That would have been
Okay.
obviously over the pale. But they do the whole trying to skirt over all the problems and make him look as sympathetic as possible. I don't know Freddie Mercury's life well enough to say factually where they may or may not have gone wrong, but it's clearly this one character, the friend character, is clearly put there to absorb all of the blame. They are the sponge through which all of the moral blame and responsibility gets pinged. Then they get excised as a scapegoat, removed from the community, and then everything's fine again.
Mm.
Which is just not how the world works.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course it is super convenient that the executive producers are the surviving band members who were in creative control over what was put on screen. I mean, that there were tensions in production and pre-production. Originally, there was a different actor slated. It was Sacha Baron Cohen was actually slated to play him, and I guess there were creative differences.
Really?
Yeah, he was the original person that was cast. He was attached to the project for a long time, and from what I remember, people were saying that it was going to be really epic, but he had some huge creative differences, and I wonder if this was part of it. If it was that he was looking at this kind of like, hey, this is very like saccharine and there's no meat to this. I don't know. I'm speculating. I've heard different things, and I don't really know the behind the scenes of it. But yeah, there was a little bit of like production tension. I mean, there's always something, but maybe a little more than normal. So yeah,
Yeah, I don't want to shit on Rami Malek, but it definitely seems like the case that if Sacha Baron Cohen wanted to make a more complex character, which I would definitely believe, given his past history, that was not going to happen.
yeah. Yeah. Well, shit, man. Yeah, I have no fucking clue, man. And then it's weird because there are a lot of films that get nominated every. Like this year was a weird film. Like I'm surprised at some of the films that are getting nominated. You've got Black Panther, which I'm really surprised. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but here's the thing, and this is kind of my theory. So you got Black Panther, you got Black Klansman, you got this, and then you got Green Book, and um, I'm trying to remember what else is. If Beale Street Could Talk, did that one get nominated for some love? I think it may have.
I think it didn't get nominated for Best Picture, though. I think it got nominated for Screenplay or something.
It's almost like the Academy is trying to overcorrect for maybe certain insensitivities to minority groups, right? And so because this is about, one, it's a biopic, which Hollywood fucking loves. Two, it's about a central gay character. So that's another element where Hollywood's just going to automatically sort of like throw in its hat into that arena. And so I wonder if they're trying to overcorrect. And so maybe they're looking past, maybe unconsciously, but they're looking past some weak spots of the film just because they're trying to be so favorable to a group that is underrepresented. Well, I mean, not that they're underrepresented in Hollywood, but underrepresented in the culture at large. So maybe it's something along those lines. I don't know. I'm just trying to think from an analytical perspective.
Yeah, it could be that. And then also, last year went to Moonlight, right? Kind of indie film out of nowhere. So maybe they want to get more of the big budget popular things in there to help boost interest and ratings. I don't know. That could be
Yeah, I don't know either, man. But I literally have no desire to see this movie. I didn't have any desire to see it anyway. Like, I'm just not like a really big biopic fan. Like, I'm okay if like a good biopic, I don't mind. But like, I don't rush out to see them, but I remember I saw the trailers for this and it didn't get me excited. Just like the new Elton John one, it does not get me excited. Like,
Yeah, I do not want to see that at all.
especially after hearing how shitty Bohemian Rhapsody is, I'm like, why do I give a fuck? Like, I'm just not a big like. What, I don't know, man. Like celebrities, do I need to see more biopics about these amazing superheroes that walk amongst us? Like, I just don't fucking care, man. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm there with you, man. Wait till they make a biopic about Owls at Dawn.
Fuck yeah! Who do you want to play? Who do you want to play you?
Well, I mean, it's definitely going to be like James Franco's son. It's going to play you, right?
Paul Dano is going to play you.
Yeah, I have heard that.
Oh man, definitely Paul Dano. He's got to get his longer hair back, and totally. Oh my god,
James Franco and Paul Dano.
Oh my god, yes. Fucking, let's throw some money at this now. Oh shit.
Hey, maybe Donald Glover can play you.
Oh, we could really mix it up. I'm down.
Yeah, that'd be controversial. Get the controversial viewing interest in.
I literally tweeted this once and I believe it. He should just play every role and I would be happy. Like, I don't care if it's Robin Hood, James Bond. He could play Freddie Mercury. I don't care. He should just play every role. Just give him the roles.
They need to make another like Jesus biopic movie and then have Donald Glover star in it.
That would actually be fucking amazing.
Dude, it's called Black Jesus. It'd be awesome.
That would actually be fucking awesome. No, I think it would be awesome if you just made it, but you didn't draw attention to the fact that it was a black Jesus, because it's just so glaringly obvious that would be like very different. But you don't acknowledge it at all, And then of course everyone is gonna want to talk about it, but you don't talk about it in the film or anything. It's just Jesus is black because he was a Palestinian Jew, so he probably did not have blonde hair and blue eyes.
Yeah, I'm cool with that. Let's get Barry Jenkins on it.
That's right. That's his next one. Okay, good deal. I'll send a call out to my people.
All right, so for our main segment today, we're finishing up, finally, G.A. Cohen's If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich? Covering Chapter 10, the final chapter, which is a bit longer than most of the other chapters. So we saved it for the last episode.
Yes.
It's called Political Philosophy and Personal Behavior. And in a way, I had trouble trying to figure out where this chapter plays in the grand scheme of the argument. In one sense, it seems obvious to me that it's the final part of the argument, right? We've talked a lot about political philosophy in general, from the Rawlsian perspective, the Marxist perspective. And then there's been some of the early chapters in the book were a bit about epistemic or epistemology from the individual perspective, a little bit about, personal morality and G.A. Cohen's own story growing up in Canada as a Jewish Marxist. And it seems like this is the Aufhebung, right? Like bringing the personal and the social and political together. But at the same time, it kind of seems like he's skirting the idea of making like a big, systematic, comprehensive claim. Did you get that same kind of tension feeling throughout this?
Dude, I'm really glad you said that, because I thought there was something wrong with me. I was really disappointed with this chapter. This was my least favorite chapter of the entire thing. And I think part of the reason is because it was a lecture series. And when you're writing a lecture series, you're kind of doing it as you go, right? And at least partly, it's not like you have it crafted necessarily, I think, from the outset. At least this is my theory. It's not like you have it crafted from the outset. And of course, in the writing process, you're always going to have to be open to the flows of kind of as the argument develops, you're going to go down a different road than maybe you had charted previously. But you still have a pretty clear beginning and end in your mind. Whereas I feel like this, he kind of was like, here's my stated hypothesis, but then he kind of like didn't really follow through on articulating some of the promises that he makes at the beginning. And I feel like this chapter for me was a real letdown because it's not a sufficient synthesis. Not that he doesn't make some sort of claims where he ties together issues of equality, which he thinks that Marxism should be concerned with, but he says that Marxists don't generally concern themselves with it, so then that leads him into the Rawlsian notions of justice, and then that gets him to this final chapter where then he's saying, okay, so if we're going to believe in equality, then how can we justify those beliefs with people who are what he calls maybe rich egalitarians or whatever. But it did not feel like it. I was hoping for more, especially because he talked so much about like Christianity and religion and that personal element of ethos, and what I was hoping like conversion and transformation of self. And he gets into that a little bit in the previous sections. He kind of touches on them, but I was really hoping for like a rich engagement with something about like liberation theology, kind of. I mean, I didn't have to use the terminology or figures, but something that would be more liberation-esque. I was really hoping for a more integrated, tightly connected synthesis, and I don't think he provided that. And so I was really disappointed, actually, in this chapter.
Yeah, I know. I had the same feeling, and I think some of that comes from coming out of the more continental philosophy world, where making these big, grand, generalizable syntheses of massive contradictions is kind of the goal, right? In a lot of continental philosophy. And then if those really big generalizations don't make a lot of sense or are hard to sort of figure out how they apply specifically to different points in the world, that's fine. Who cares? Or at least that's just stuff we'll do down the road. Whereas, analytic philosophers are kind of trained in to sort of, or dissuaded from doing that, right? The idea is to try and really clearly specify a specific problem. And if you have to delve into the big generalizable stuff along the way, hint at that, point at it, mention it, talk about it, but then you need your sort of argument itself to be something clear, precise, and easy to kind of directly apply to specific circumstances. And I think so much of the book kind of hinted at those big questions that we really want to talk about. I think you mentioned especially the idea of the social ethos and conversion and personal transformation and stuff like that. He hinted at it in this chapter too, talking a bit about, I can't remember where it was in the chapter, talking a bit about where the social ethos would be so important because it's possible that like capitalism over the last couple hundred years has transformed humanity into something incapable of working in a socialist system. Maybe we need to be transformed in some way. And that was super interesting. But then he didn't go down that road because that's, a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, 100%. But here's the thing. This has been just kind of like my hobby horse lately because this does kind of come out of a lot of the research in my book. But I feel like, and I don't want to just simply valorize the dialectic as though this is like the benchmark by which all rationality should be measured. But I will say this here, and I hope we can take it for what it's worth and maybe unpack it. But I feel like it's because he's insufficiently dialectical in his engagement. Or let's say he's insufficiently... oh God, maybe it's just because I'm so inclined towards genealogical critiques or towards deconstruction or towards problematizing and unpacking perpetually. He seems too quick to want to hold on to certain received interpretations of terms without really wanting to get into it. The point that got me the most excited in this chapter is when he starts to talk about like what is the quality or the substance of equality or inequality. But he only devotes like 4 paragraphs to it and then he moves on and he says, yeah, that's something we should talk about. But then he doesn't really talk about it, right? Like what is the difference between welfare and the welfarist and the resourcist, and how, well, should we be concerned with kind of just more than just like brute survival of resources and things like that when we're talking about equality and having being an egalitarian. But he doesn't really get into like, what do you mean by equality? Does it just simply mean that everyone has access to healthcare and water and food and clothes and shelter? Or does it also mean that everybody's happy and that everybody feels nurtured and that everybody feels supported and loved and that they have community? Like, he doesn't get into those things, and that's the stuff that I think is so crucial if we're going to develop a robust materialist conception of the world that then would inform our Marxism, which I think is secondary to really having a proper metaphysics. And I feel like that's it. He's insufficiently metaphysical in this. And that's, I think, the thing that I was ultimately frustrated with at the outcome.
Yeah, I think I understand that and mostly agree. I do think it's important to only judge, an argument in a text based upon its stated goals. But then you can also critique its stated goals. But you have to keep those two criticisms in kind of like in separate spheres, so to speak, right? And I think from its own line of argument, I think we can say there's some disappointment because of all the big stuff that was talked about, and stuff about the personal behavior, I think is something worth talking about. But I think we could have, even given the content of the rest of the book, Cohen could have talked a little bit more about the idea of personal transformation. It was hinted at enough that I think it was worth bringing up at greater length, rather than just talking about this idea of taxation and whatnot, as pertinent as I think that is to like everyday life. And then,
but he doesn't say anything about Jesus or anything about religion in the end. Like he said, those are the three things. He says it's going to be about like Rawls, Marx, and then his more recent fascination with religion. He doesn't really address that third point at all.
Well, I think part of Lecture 7 was that. It was the theodicy idea. But I don't know if that involved any talk about conversion or personal transformation. It's lost to the sands of time. But I do feel the same thing. There's talk here about kind of individual and personal behavior and stuff, but kind of skirts the whole conversion religion issue that he brought up as part of the triad in the beginning. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. All right. But with that said, as a chapter that engages with what I do think is a really interesting question, like, that's the other thing. I feel like it was insufficient based on what I thought the stated goals were going to be. As somebody who maybe comes to a text because I tend to expect that somebody is going to build a whole system on how to fucking synthesize Marx, Rawls, and Jesus. So I'm thinking that it's going to be that. So maybe that's my fault for projecting too much. But what it does do is it does deal with a potential inconsistency that I think was actually really refreshing and interesting to engage, especially because he is an analytical philosopher, because he's so precise in trying to parse out the sort of logical consistency in the context of like normative justice or even like descriptive understandings of equality or inequality. And I thought that was actually really good, and that's the consistency about how can you be an egalitarian and be a comfy philosophy professor and make like 3 or 4 times what the average person makes. Basically saying, I'm a rich egalitarian. Is that a contradiction? Should I give more money? What are my duties? What are the rich egalitarian person's duties more broadly, et cetera, et cetera? And I thought that was a really important question because it does have a lot of relevance even for contemporary debates about like even like veganism. Like, should you be a vegan? What is your personal responsibility, especially if you're going to be a committed leftist and you're going to say that we should rely on like structural and material critiques? And I thought that was a really important thing to engage with.
Yeah, and I think the generalized portion, right? The title of the book, if you're an egalitarian argument so much, is very specific, right? It's addressing a very small segment of people who are the readership, probably, or maybe it's a larger segment, given that academics in the UK maybe are a little bit more well off than most academics in America. But the generalizable question is, what does justice demand of individuals when they are in an unjust society? That's the generalizable question, which applies to literally everybody. There's nobody who escapes that injunction, right? So given that we live in an unjust society, what does justice demand of us? And I think, I didn't even think about this, but yeah, you're right that the question of something like, what do you eat? The thing you do multiple times every single day is involved in that question. So it's definitely intimate and personal, and it's not in any way a purely abstract philosophical question.
Yeah. 100%, because you do hear this a lot in the cultural debates surrounding veganism, for example, right? Some people will try to argue at an empirical level and say, well, the reason that you should go vegan is because, for a single egg to get produced, it's like X amount of gallons of water that are required just to produce a single egg. And so if we cut down our egg consumption, we'd actually cut down water consumption. There are places in America where there are droughts, Southern California and elsewhere. Australia's having a drought, so we would have better possibility for a more equitable distribution of the scarce resources of water if we cut down our egg, something like that, right? Or agricultural farming runoff, or cows produce more methane than carbon production, and so it'll actually help with the greenhouse effects, things like that. And then some people will then say, okay, so therefore, because we know that, you should be plant-based because that's the morally right thing to do, which I think fits into the syllogism that he establishes. He says, if you believe that X is right, then should you do that thing? And if you don't do that thing, are you somehow violating this principle? right? And then that's when he talks about acrasis or acrasia with regards to like Socrates and Aristotle and whatnot. This idea of, do people do things that they know to be wrong? Is that possible? Or if you're doing something, is it always because you don't necessarily know it to be wrong, but there's some sort of justification for you doing it? And he kind of like navigates through that. And I think that really does impinge on, even like what clothes you buy. Should you buy clothes at a secondhand store? Should you buy brand label clothes? Or should you just buy like no label clothes? Should you make your own clothes?
Should
that
you wear no
shit.
clothes?
Should you take?
That's your
Should you wear no
method.
clothes? Yeah. Should you, take public transportation and sell your car or ride a bicycle? Like, what is your individual personal responsibility as a member of a larger society?
Yeah, and I love that, the question of acrasia or whatever is a major question in analytic philosophy and moral philosophy today, at least over the last, 20, 25 years. And the major problem being, is it sort of possible to believe that one ought to do X and then not have any intention to do X? Is that even like logically possible?
Right.
And so he kind of just says, I don't care about that. Or at least says, I'm not going to talk about that right now. Because his major question is sort of adjunct to that. And it's whether or not it's possible to believe that one ought to do X, not intend to do X, and also believe that not doing X, even though you ought to do it, is not out of line with your principles. That's the major question, right? Because that's the claim that the rich egalitarian makes, is that, I don't act in such a way that I would if it were a just society. I believe that I should act that way, but I am justified in not doing it in a way that means I can still act rationally according to my principles. And he brings up this distinction here that I like a lot between excuse and justification. And this helped me a lot to think about how you can separate these two kind of ideas in your mind. He says that excuses admit that X should have been done, but relieves one of criticism for various reasons. And then justification claims that X is not what one should have done in the first place at all. And so what he's saying is that the rich egalitarian, if they're just making excuses, that's fine. Yeah, I should probably give more money, but I don't because I'm kind of a dick sometimes. What are you going to do? Like that's fine, right? You're at least admitting you should do differently. A justification means you're saying, no, I don't have to at all. If I were in a just society, I would, but I'm not in a just society, so I don't have to. And
you're absolved from the responsibility.
Right, yeah, it's letting the unjust society, the state of social conditions, sort of absolve your responsibility, exactly. Which, again, I wish we could have talked a little bit more about the religious aspects of this, because it's very much a cleansing of one's sins.
Yeah, what do you think about this? Because this doesn't sit right with me.
What doesn't sit right?
The idea that you absolve yourself. So, okay, how do I work through this here? Because there's so much here. Okay, first of all, I'm curious. So let's say it's the issue of being an egalitarian, right? So we'll just take that and let's not get too far in the weeds with anything else here. So, if you claim to be an egalitarian, what I want to know is, first of all, what does that mean? Right? Now, he does talk about this a little bit, but I think that's crucial. And I don't think that you can engage too much in the syllogistic reasoning unless you, first of all, define what belief means and what egalitarian means or what equality means. Because if you don't define those terms, if you don't unpack them, then you engage at a level of vulgar abstraction, or what Bertel Ullman might call violent abstraction. And it's an insufficient sort of formal category. And I think that we need to be always perpetually redefining these abstractions that we're using to employ when we're engaging in conceptual thinking. So I want to know, first of all, what is egalitarian? When you say that you're an egalitarian, does that mean that you believe, and then we can define belief in a second, but that you intellectually assent to the statement that all people should have access to the basic resources for survival? Is that what it means? Or does it mean which is a statement about society. It's a statement about the subject matter. Or is it a methodological, or let's say a dispositional statement, or about the sensibility, let's say, of a person that believes that all of one's actions should have equality in mind? So I walked home last night with a pizza, and if a little kid walked by with his parents and was like, "Oh, pizza," would an egalitarian, not operating necessarily even under the rubric of a should, because that still implies some sort of formal mechanism that I'm imposing, but would there not be a disposition that I would want to make this little boy happy because he saw my box of pizza, and I'd want to give him a slice of my pizza? That's different. That's dispositional. That's not necessarily simply referring to like the empirical or the subject matter. So I'd want to know, what do you mean when you say egalitarian?
Yeah, so
do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I think so.
Go ahead.
So I think if you're like the old grandma in the community who like bakes cookies for everybody in town or whatever, and you just have these natural sort of inclination to, it's not natural necessarily, you could have sort of built it up over time, but you have this inclination, at least, whether developed or natural, towards egalitarian actions or behaviors. That's certainly a thing, right? But I don't think Cohen would have any bones to pick with you at that point, right? Because he's addressing specifically a certain kind of egalitarian, which is the former that you were talking about. It's the one who has a principled egalitarianism, right? Who's sort of developed some intellectual formal structure that justifies egalitarianism as some preferred outcome. And he does, there's two different kinds of that exist, at least. One he called relational egalitarians, who think that equality as such is just the best outcome in society. So it's this purely a normative thing about equality as such. And then prioritarians, who argue that the best outcome involves whatever's best for the worst off. So inequality or equality as such is not necessarily a primary good or anything, but whatever sort of brings the worst off into something better. Maybe it's subsistence, or maybe it's some degree of luxury, whatever it is. But both those have in common the sort of structure of intellectual justification that was your former category, right?
Right. And the prioritarian is kind of like his inversion of the difference principle from Rawls.
Yeah, Rawls would be involved in there, right? But you could be a prioritarian without being Rawlsian.
Right. That's kind of like his kind of transformation of it, or reworking of it, or whatever.
Yeah, it's just a broader umbrella term that the kind of Rawlsian difference principle would fall under.
Okay, so then that's what he means by egalitarian. So then what do you mean by belief? So I was thinking a lot about, in particular, for people who are listening, so we could maybe do a callback to our episode with Peter Rollins. And remember when we were talking about what it is that someone believes? So, and I kind of recounted that story that he kind of told at Calvin College, where it was like, like, what do you really believe? Well, sometimes I believe in this, and sometimes I don't believe this based on my actions. And then he said, well, I want to go even further now. It's not just what you do that demonstrates what you believe, but he talked about parapraxis. And how sometimes even, the things that you do are kind of being deceptive or something like that. So again here, I just think that there's a really sort of like unexamined understanding of what belief means in relation to egalitarianism here. And I would want to go much more into kind of like unpacking, what do you mean by belief in relation to egalitarianism, right?
Yeah, I think,
because I'm not comfortable with intellectual assent being sufficient for understanding belief. And I think that's how he defines it.
Well, yeah, I don't think he's defining it like that in total. I think this is part of the weakness and narrowness of analytic philosophy, right? You can fully be an analytic philosopher and admit that you have these things like parapraxis or whatever, or the psychoanalytic readings of belief and action and all that kind of stuff. But then you just say, I'm not talking about that right now. What I'm talking about is the giving back and forth of reasons, right? Reasons and justifications for things, which is a thing. It may be a very narrow view of human life, like like your Heidegger horse, and be like, this is just the present at hand bullshit. Most of the time, it's the ready at hand stuff that we use in everyday life. And yeah, maybe that stuff all holds. And so this may be a narrow conception of belief, but it's still a conception of belief. And
right.
To be fair, Cohen is addressing a specific kind of person, the kind of person who's a rich egalitarian, which means they have this sort of worked out principled justification for why they do what they do. Now, all he's doing is saying, is it consistent? So maybe for most people, this is not how they think about, social ethos and what's the best outcome in society and all that kind of stuff. But for this kind of person, and I think you and I both fall into this as well, as people who think long and hard about the best kind of society and come up with justifications and arguments for those things. That's the kind of thing that's at least worth pursuing, if it's not the only thing worth pursuing regarding belief in equality.
Absolutely. Okay, yeah. No, I don't disagree with you there. I guess you're right. I'm being a little bit uncharitable, and I think it's because I'm criticizing him for not doing the thing that I think I wish I would want him to do, which is kind of unfair when you're criticizing somebody. You sort of have to kind of take them and meet them where they're at. So I am being, I'm rushing. Yeah. So I'm rushing a little bit, and I'm being a bit hypercritical. But I just found it a little bit lacking, because even then I just don't think that that's a sufficient, like, you can't finish your book at that point. You have to be like, at least acknowledge that, hey, this is only partial. There are all these other aspects as well. We need to realize that people have, unconscious motivations or whatever. I just feel like you got to try. You got to try as much as possible to open up to those things,
Yeah,
isn't
but dude, that's just because you want to hug everything in the world.
That is true. What did we have? Our episode, what was it called? Panphilia? I just want to feel it all.
Yeah, panphilia.
I know. No, that is true. Okay, well, I guess, is there anything in particular that really stands out about this chapter that you want to engage with?
So I guess we can kind of talk about for a second. I think the most important thing he talked about, which is probably the best counter argument, is Thomas Nagel's argument against sort of why it's rational to not voluntarily give money, but then also want there to be a just society where there'd be heavy taxation upon you and you would lose that money.
Yeah, so just real quick for people. So the issue is so should the moral responsibility to give money if you make, above a comfortable living wage, be placed upon you so that you directly are motivated to give your money? Should you be compelled to give money? Should you be coerced by the state who forces you by sort of extracting taxes? That's what Cohen is kind of working through here, is what are the sort of mechanisms that enforce justice, let's say, with on an individual in an unjust society with regards to wealth and riches.
Yeah, and there's two main kind of points here that he's jumping off from. One is, are you really a principled egalitarian consistently and rationally if you don't act in such a way as you would if you were in a just society? And so the second thing is, he wants to, I think, at least hint at this idea that you were bringing up earlier, which I think is really important, that this involves all personal behavior, not just the kind of locus that he's focusing on here, which is taxation and voluntarily giving money. So you could replace taxation here with eating habits, right? You could replace it with how you treat the local schools in your neighborhood. You could replace it with any personal behavior that in some way affects the social, which is really everything when you get down to it, to different levels. So I think it's a much bigger question than just the taxation question. That's just an obvious one because it's probably the one where people have the starkest differences of behavior given different social conditions, if that makes sense. Like there's people who will say, I'd be fine with 70% top marginal tax rates, but would never in a million years give up 70% of their income over $10 million to, worthy charities or whatever. And that's the point where Cohen's like, that seems kind of weird. How does that happen?
Yeah, that's the Warren Buffett position, right?
Does he? I don't know how much money he actually gives, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it's not 1960s top marginal tax rates.
Right, exactly. I mean, I'm sure he gives a ton away. I know that is one of the things, but he does talk about, he's like, yeah, there should be a much higher marginal tax rate for the super wealthy. And then you constantly get kind of conservative, more libertarian, flat tax types that come out in response to him. And they're like, well, why don't you just give all your money away then, Warren? And it's kind of like, well, why don't you read this final chapter of this text? And then you can have some stuff to think through, motherfuckers.
So Thomas Nagel's argument is the mental burden argument. And the idea here is Nagel thinks that it's proper for the state to automatically tax individuals, but it's improper to expect individuals to voluntarily give this same amount on their own in the absence of the proper taxation, since the latter involves, or since the sort of voluntarily giving up money involves a mental burden which is excessively difficult to overcome by pure force of will, and taxation relieves that, because what are you going to do? Like, fight the IRS?
Right.
And that has some prima facie like intuitive appeal, I think. It is definitely true that I don't fret too much about the fact that, payroll taxes take money out of my paycheck. But if someone robbed me of that money, I guess that would be improper, because I have the danger to my life and whatnot. But the idea of sort of giving up that much money every paycheck to some other cause, it's voluntary, would be a lot harder, because I'd have to think about the trade-off of what else I could use it for, or just the idea of having it in the bank itself. The fact that taxes are just like a brute fact about the world seems easier to accept.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so hard for me, because I feel like there's just I just want to then talk about what is the nature of taxation here, though. So it seems to me that there's a fundamental problem here, though, with the formulation. The problem is that the idea is that somehow that you have earned that money, and then it's taken from you after you have earned it, which I think is a fundamentally insufficient way of understanding the system of taxation and wealth creation and money in a given society. So I think that there's something inherently lacking in that, because it presumes that somehow there's like this notion of like private property that has been given to you, and then you are then in a quandary with what to do with it based on a principle of redistribution after this private property has already been acquired by you. And I think that language is already succumbing to a notion of personal property rights that I think is insufficient. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think Cohen would 100% agree with you, right? I mean, he's a socialist.
Right.
So that's an argument for taxation itself.
Right.
Right? As not being theft or whatever. I think that's totally true. I think the idea here is, if we're just trying to explain why somebody would support that, what you just said, that argument, and for why taxation is justified, but then wouldn't also voluntarily give their money absent of that taxation.
Right. But do you think that maybe they wouldn't support it is because they're already buying into some notion of personal property rights?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Because they think, I earned this. This is my money. But if you can reason with them and kind of explain to them how social value works within a different framework, then it kind of creates a whole different perspective around how we understand value and distribution or pre-distribution of value.
Yeah, I think 100%. The idea here, I think, is that a person doesn't really actually internalize that. Or it's very, very difficult to internalize that when you also have these sort of almost like proto-natural drives for accumulating for yourself.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
Yeah,
and so what's Cohen's retort to Nagel?
I think also like Nagel would probably agree with you, right? I mean, I don't know what Nagel's ideas on taxation are. I know he supports much higher taxation, given the context here, but I think you could fully agree with that and still say, given these other drives that we have, there's a mental burden on voluntarily giving money. So it's really hard. Actually, that's actually an argument for taxation, because, the sort of conservative reply to heavy taxation is, oh no, personal private charity can cover the gap of heavy taxation and provide for people who are most needy. But if anything, this argument is saying, no, they won't do it because it's really hard mentally to make yourself give to charity. We need heavy taxation to be done forcibly because individuals won't internalize this idea of giving up their money for others. So this could be an argument.
And I think if you look at the numbers, empirically, that does bear out as well.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Even with massive, massive wealth inequality. Jeff Bezos gives the sort of a proportion of like $40 a year of the average person's salary towards charity. It's
like our antagonistic friend at our conservative Christian school once said, if Christians actually believed and enacted their principles of charity, there would be no homelessness in the world.
Yeah. And then you have on top of that, of course, we're getting into like a criticism of charity here. Those charities often end up being their own personal, 503c corporations,
Right.
The Clinton Foundation, the Trump Foundation, and whatnot, which are oftentimes extremely corrupt and don't do anything for the worst off. Or they're like charter schools, really controversial ideas that don't necessarily benefit people, or maybe actually have the sort of external effect of destroying public services, like public schools. That's a whole other issue.
Yeah.
So Cohen's rejoinder is that he doesn't think it makes a lot of sense to say that the individual decision to give your money would actually be harder than supporting heavy taxation. It might seem like it is, but that's because of some sort of externalities that don't necessarily have to be the case. So he says you could set up your bank account to automatically transfer money, right? And then you wouldn't have to do it every month and have this agonizing decision, right? And then also, if you really honestly support heavy taxation, imagine 2028 or 32 or whatever comes around and AOC is running for president, and we're going to get our 70% marginal tax rates if she wins, right? You would have to vote for that if you actually believe that's the right thing, right? If you cast your vote for AOC in 2028, then that means you're voting for 70% marginal tax rates, more or less, we'll say in this hypothetical. So why would putting your name or sort of putting the check mark on the box for the vote be any different than actually sort of taking the money out of your account? It seems like the same action, right? If we assume that, one guarantees or both guarantee the effect of losing 70% of your income over a certain rate. So he doesn't think the mental burden argument really works out in the end.
Is this where he makes his distinction between difficulty and cost?
Yeah. So the distinction that you want to talk about, the distinction there?
Yeah, so I guess, I think if I understand it, if something is difficult, that just means that it presents certain obstacles that you need to overcome or to surmount in order to accomplish it. And something is costly if something is, it deprives you of something. So there's a deprivation element to it that is required for something to be costly. And so that's the distinction there. So casting a vote might be difficult, but is casting a vote costly? Does it somehow deprive you of something? And I obviously it seems prima facie that no, it might be difficult because you have to, take work off, especially in the United States where the polling stations are open for some strange reason during fucking work hours. But you have to take work off and go down and find a polling station and wait in line for a long time. And maybe you get a shitty lunch because of it. And it's 100 degrees outside and you have to stand in line and there aren't that many machines. So it might there's a level of difficulty, but is it costly? Would you say that you've somehow lost something? Yeah, you could maybe, if you really wanted to nitpick and be like, oh, I lost a couple hours at work, or I lost some sweat, or I lost a measure of joy because I stood in a line and got frustrated with a machine or something like that. But ultimately, really not really. There's not really a cost associated with casting a vote, even if there might be a difficulty. So that's
the cost is the same as giving up the money voluntarily.
Right.
They're essentially the same cost, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so he kind of dismisses that argument. I think he's probably right about that, although it still feels to me a bit like what you were saying earlier is the most important point to get at. This sort of internalizing of the egalitarian position goes against the impulses that capitalism sort of develops in us for accumulation of wealth and whatnot. And those aren't natural impulses. They're not sort of part of human nature. They're certainly inculcated from into us from a very young age and by everything in culture. And that seems like the key issue to me. Is it's not a surprise to me that people act in these contradictory fashions, right? And I think you can kind of get that out of the Cohen text here. He's saying it's not rational to want a just society with heavy taxation, but then not act that way in an unjust society. Why is that? Well, I think it's because we have these other impulses towards wealth accumulation, which, a capitalist society inculcates you from a very young age. And that's the reason why. And so we can kind of get to that through Cohen's argument, I think, that you can't really consistently hold this position of being a rich egalitarian.
And this brings us full circle to the first chapter when he's talking about the irrationality of beliefs.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
or the rationality or irrationality.
And so
Okay.
the end of the book here, I don't know about you, but I was super disappointed by the end of the book just because of how kind of like limp it seemed. He talks about the relative disadvantage problem. I loved the little epilogue or whatever it was. That was super great.
About Maury.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
Yeah.
But the end of the chapter, he calls the relative disadvantage problem, which is the reason why it's rational to desire group taxation but not engage in heavy voluntary giving, according to this argument, is that in the absence of heavy taxation, the latter puts one at a relative disadvantage compared to other wealthy people, which are part of one's peer group, and they don't engage in similar giving, right? And so I think this really gets out to sort of the social idea that we were talking about a little bit here, that when you're rich, your peer group are other people who are rich, who are similarly educated and live in the same areas and whatnot, and their kids go to the same schools, and you are involved in some of the same cultural productions and exercises that they are. And if you give away a huge amount of your money as if you lived in a just society, you are no longer part of that peer group in a lot of ways. And your children maybe won't have the same advantages that your friends' children have. And there's some
and you won't be able to impart your beautiful wisdom at these types of prestigious lectureships.
Yeah, that's what you always hear, right? I got to go to Davos so I can talk to all the billionaires about giving away their money.
Right.
Yeah, it was such obviously bullshit. But there is some respect, which I think that it's correct that this is probably one of the main reasons, right?
Yeah.
Yes, part of it's the selfish drive towards wealth accumulation. But people are, and rich people, as much as we want to demonize them, they're thinking people. Like, they think about this stuff. And I bet you the majority of people rationalize their decision not to give away their money with something basically like this. Right? This is how they think. Yeah.
So the question is he making an excuse or is he providing valid justification?
Well, I think he's saying this is how they would justify it or attempt to justify it, right? And he kind of ends it by saying, maybe this has some credence. I don't know. And I was just like, no, it doesn't. It doesn't have any credence at all. I felt like you could have gone a lot harder on this idea and been like, it's just so obviously wrong. Like, if your peer group is entirely dependent upon like $300 dinners, then your peer group sucks ass. Objectively. So that doesn't get better friends, right? I just didn't have a lot of patience for this.
So I listened to a conversation that he had with somebody in an interview. I think it was actually Nigel Warburton on Philosophy Bites. I listened to where he's talking about this. And I similarly felt disappointed because he basically made some of these same points. And to me, what it reeked of is that this last bit was more particularly him trying to justify his own position. Like, this is why I don't give a larger portion of my comfy paycheck and that I am a rather affluent, professor at a prestigious British university. And like, he wasn't even teaching at this time. I think he was just like getting a fat research paycheck or something like that. And I think, and I get it, and I don't know, I'm still working through this. This is just one of those really fucking tough issues for me. But like, part of me wants to go fucking St. Francis of Assisi poverty on this shit, and be like, come on, man. Like, I don't know. It still seems inconsistent to me.
Yeah, that's what I took from it, is that it's inconsistent.
It seems, I don't want to say a contradiction. It seems hypocritical to me. That's what I want to say. Not contradiction, because that could be productive. It seems hypocritical to me. And I'm just not sure, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about hypocritical, because it's trying to come up with intellectual justification for it. I just think the intellectual justification is inconsistent. Like, it's just saying what he was talking about earlier, that I believe that I should do X, but I'm not doing it, and I'm sort of consistent with my principles to do so, and that those three don't hold up. It's not a logical contradiction, but it is an inconsistency when you derive certain ideas from those statements. I think that just still holds up. I don't think that argument had as much sway as he did, but maybe we're just, millennials post-financial crisis, poor, and so that's just never going to have any sway with us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you mentioned the bit about like living in the shadow or the wake of the financial crisis, because I was just thinking about this the other day. I went off to grad school in England in 2009. I graduated university, that same year actually. So I graduated in May and I left in September. And I actually was working the year prior to that in the financial industry. I was working as a consultant for commercial lenders, and so I remember how much it impacted my business, but for some reason I didn't feel the material effects of it. Now, obviously, there are all kinds of reasons where I was kind of protected from feeling, I guess, the full weight of the collapse, right? Like I didn't have a house taken away. One of my best friends, I remember he defaulted on his loan, on his house, but his was more of like a strategic thing, He was like, well, everybody else is doing it, so fuck, we're just going to save money for the next 6 or 8 months and not pay our mortgage, default on our loan, and kind of get out the back door of this mortgage, and then we're just going to rent a place. Yeah, we'll take the hit on our credit, but fuck it, So I know a lot of people did that too, but I personally didn't really feel any of the material consequences from it. It was more like I was on the phone with bankers and, talking about their tightening of their liquidity, and their underwriting procedures basically had halted because they weren't giving out any new loans to anybody, and like stuff like that. But then I went off to university and I was in England, and I was just thinking the other day, like, even when I was in England in 2009 around academic people and around people that were doing work loosely related to economics, for some reason, I feel like even then it didn't hit me. Like I didn't realize how severe it was. It wasn't until like, God, years later that I kind of started to realize how impactful the financial crisis, the financial crisis was, And I mean, and even on myself in my own life, I haven't seen like a huge hit, right? It's not like I was making, I had a certain standard of living and then somehow it drastically decreased or anything like that. And again, there are certain kind of mitigating factors that have prevented me from feeling the full brunt of that, and I've been very fortunate. But as far as my awareness of it, how it has impacted the broader culture and the broader society, it's becoming a much more of a palpable thing now, and it's starting to inform now the way that I view politics, the way that I view society. And then maybe what you just said is I'm having like a delayed reaction. Like in 2007 to 2009, I wouldn't have had this same type of like gut reaction because of, the financial crisis. But maybe now in 2019, I'm like, yeah, you're the point that you just made. I'm like, yeah, fucking, that's probably a huge component. It's almost like it's had like this delayed, like a slow leak in its effect on my rationality. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think it's kind of parallel to, I'm not saying these at all in terms of the impact they've had, but it's parallel in some sense to the way 9/11 affected our sort of international political imagination, right? That just totally shaped the way you think about international politics forever.
Dude, yeah.
And the financial crisis in a similar way affects the way you think about domestic economic and political economic circumstances forever, if you were someone who graduated during that.
Yeah. I mean, I'd go even a step further and say that, like, what's really interesting is to look at film, for example, pre 9/11 and post 9/11. And this is something that Keir, in I Dig This Movie podcast that I do, has mentioned to me a few times. And it wasn't until he mentioned it that I started seeing it more, especially as I've watched now pre-2001 films and post-2001 films. And there is a sense at the end of the 90s that there's a sort of like different portrayal of American culture, and definitely a different portrayal of like global military strategies involving the United States. And then, of course, post 9/11, it is very different. And I wonder if we can do the same thing with the GFC.
Well, it's definitely the same thing. I mean, I'm just thinking on a small scale here. I just finished the HBO show Big Little Lies.
Okay,
you watch that?
I haven't. I've heard it's really good though.
Yeah, it's really good. But one thing that I noticed is, without talking about the plot too much, what's that actress's name? Shailene Woodley?
Yeah, Shailene Woodley. Yeah.
Yeah, she's supposed to be, I think, in her mid-20s or late 20s in the show. And she's a single mom who has like a 6-year-old kid. And she just shows up in the beginning of the show and buys a house in Monterey, California, in like one of the best school districts in like the country or whatever. That's the kind of the whole point of the plot, is that it's a great school district. I'm just thinking, like, how does this single mom who is unemployed for most of the show, or at least spottily employed, precariously employed, buy this house in Monterey? Like, how's that a thing? Like, there's nobody who's my age in their late 20s or early 30s who's able to do that. And
Right.
That on a small scale makes you think that that would have been a thing in the 90s, and no one would have batted an eye at that probably. But now that seems just incredibly, just breaks the realism of the whole thing.
Yeah. Interesting. So, was there anything else you wanted to cover before we kind of wrap this up? Our book club. This is our longest book club, I think, at least spread out over duration, it seems.
Yeah, for sure. There was one thing I wanted to bring up, and maybe this is just something we can talk about for like 2 seconds and be done with it, but it comes up a lot, I find, in discussions around the ethics of taxation and stuff like that. And I'm kind of unsure what to think about it, and I wanted to get your take. And Cohen mentions it here, although it doesn't go on and really give like a really sustained view or anything. But there's this argument that people who have had relative advantage compared to others and then lose that advantage suffer more loss than someone who just starts out not having the advantage in the first place. And that argument can oftentimes be weaponized for very obviously bad faith reasons, like we can't tax people who are really rich and give it to the poor because the poor are used to being poor and they're happy with it because they're simple-minded folk, and it's obviously like racist and classist and all that kind of stuff, right? But aside from all that, obviously bad faith use of that argument, is there anything to it if you shave off the bad faith stuff, or if you shave off the bad faith stuff, is it just gone? Like it's just hollow?
Right. I mean, it's like saying, so here's an analogous one, and maybe this will demonstrate some of the problems. So somebody who his entire life or her entire life has experienced great physical harm from the moment they were born, just constant pain, some sort of chronic illness, constantly in pain. What's that? Is it fibromyalgia, the one where it's just pain and there's like no cause for it? Or like they can't find the cause? Something like that, right? That's what they've suffered with their whole life. So that person operates at, let's just use a numeric scale, at a level of a 2 in terms of the eradication of pleasure, or the eradication of pain, right? That's their pleasure level, 2. They just can't get higher than that. But then there's somebody who's happy as fuck, born into an amazing environment, supportive family, able to play youth sports and have amazing meals and travel the world and see great art and experience their own engagement with politics and, I don't know, doing like international, like helping with clean water. I mean, this person has just, lived this crazy life and they're operating at a 10. If all of a sudden that person takes a hit because of, say, for example, an economic collapse, and they go down to an 8, are we really supposed to think that their step backwards is somehow greater as a quantifiable harm than the person who simply operates at the same low hum for his or her entire life, even though the other person is measurably experiencing 1, pain, but also 2, a much less standard or quality of life, according to that numerical scale? And I don't think so. I think that that's fundamentally deficient as an argument. And I think it's partly because it's using a sort of like scientific or positivistic or quantifiable rationale. It's like trying to use like a law of equivalency here, and I'm not sure that you can actually do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely agree with you that there seems to be something wrong with it. Although I do want to say that it does ring to me true that the loss of something is a greater suffering or a greater harm than simply not having it at all. That seems true to me. But then the jump from that to some normative sense of, therefore, we should try to stop loss, even if it means continuing structural or systemic or continuous harm. That's the part that seems to me to be off. If anything, I would think that argument is maybe not like a logical reductio ad absurdum, but for me at least, it's kind of a persuasive reductio, in that if you have some of these kind of utilitarian presuppositions about pleasure and pain and what constitutes the good and stuff like that. It seems to me you kind of have to make that leap, at least somewhat. Maybe you can get around it. I'm not really sure, but it seems that you have to really place this idea of loss of advantage as a kind of important form of harm that's equal to other forms of harm, maybe. And that just seems to me intuitively so off. And not just because it's used as a justification for, the status quo or for like structural inequities and stuff like that, but just on its own, even on individual cases, it just seems so off, right? There's no way in which we can really equate loss of an advantage as being as harmful as any other kind of harm, even if it's quantifiably in terms of like the pain experienced or the suffering experienced might be on the same level. They're just not the same thing. So we need to have an account of why they're not the same thing.
Right. Also, loss of advantage in one area might provide greater advantage in another area. So for an individual like Warren Buffett, who is like, yeah, let's have higher marginal tax rates. So let's say they institute the 70% number that's been floated around because of the AOC interview, right? So Warren Buffett takes a hit, let's say 20% more of his income now is going towards taxes. But at the same time, is there a sense in which he might feel a sense of pride that he's contributing to a society, that he realizes that now the system is more just? So there might be a loss of advantage in one arena in the sense of simple monetary terms, but in qualitative social experience, there might be a benefit. So again, this is, I think, we have to complicate. We have to realize that there are different angles to the notion of advantage or disadvantage, and to loss and to gain. Loss in one arena doesn't necessarily just mean loss per se. That's too sort of vulgar. That's too bland. That's too oversimplified of categorization. And go ahead.
Yeah, and on top of that, there's also the alienation and other externalities that result from living in an unjust society, even if you're at the advantaged end, right? There's a form of moral and personal corruption that happens when you are extremely wealthy. I mean, the stats do show that extreme wealth does not necessarily make you have a more satisfied life. We know this.
Right. I mean, maybe we could compare it. Remember how we talked about how pain a couple of episodes back, and like the idea of working out, how it's painful, but you realize that the benefits are good at the end, right? Or like you get a shot in your butt or your arm and it hurts, but you realize that it's for good. So maybe this is like the initial shock of having, 10% or 20% of your valuation or your wealth sort of redistributed, let's say, even though I don't like the idea of, I've been thinking a lot more about the idea of like a pre-distributionary notion, but we can get into that another time. But let's just say, okay, so you have an immediate shock, but nevertheless, in the long term, it's beneficial. Maybe you won't ultimately experience it because you're just hardened and you're stingy with your money, and so you're a fucking Scrooge. So maybe you might not experience it, but subsequently down the line, it does ultimately have a long-term benefit. And if you allowed yourself, even if you were stingy and curmudgeon-y, you could open yourself up to the possibility of those greater social benefits that would come with the kind of initial shock, or that could result from the initial shock of the shot, so to speak.
Yeah, and to bring back that analogy we talked about in that previous episode, the point I was making was that I think it's intuitive that pain is not theoretically identical with badness, and that there are times when pain itself is a good. So the shot in the butt thing, if you're getting inoculated or whatever, that's just like a lesser evil, right? So it's bad. You don't like it. It's just that you have to do it because of the way that the world works. Sometimes you have to get a shot in the ass to not get, the measles or whatever.
To not get
but
dead.
when it comes to things like working out or exercising or playing a sport or whatever, the pain actually, I think, is a good, not in and of itself, but as a part of the whole experience. If you took away the pain of working out or playing a sport or whatever, I think we wouldn't actually enjoy it as much. There's something about putting the effort into it and overcoming that obstacle of the pain that is good. Now, obviously, if your body's breaking down and other factors can make it bad, right? It's only like special sweet spot where it's good. But that really is like a part, and a constitutive good part of the experience. And we could argue that there is something about being involved in a society and sacrificing of oneself for a greater good that's really high-minded, and most governments are never going to actually do that, right? But just as like a theoretical entity here, that could be better, and think probably would be better than like the vast accumulation of wealth, so that you're like Smaug sitting on shit tons of gold in a mountain, right? Which is just going to corrupt you to no end.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I also think that this is where I'd want to bring in a little bit of like psychoanalysis and think about the idea of cathexis in the cathected object. So what is the object that's being taken away? And how is it that you have come to value that object so intensely, right? And what is our relationship to these objects that we sort of like imbue ourselves literally into? And how does that experience of the loss of that object affect us? Why does it affect us? And what way can we better adjust ourselves to the loss of that object? And can we equate like psychoanalytic trauma to the loss of one's wealth? Well, in a very, and I'm not trying to provide justification or cover, let's say, but I'm trying to give an explanation. But say you are very wealthy and you do lose 20% of your wealth because of an increase in like marginal tax rates or something like that. You have imbued yourself. Your part of your identity is being a billionaire. You have imbued so much of yourself into your wealth, your assets, the things that you have, because those things translate into social power and value and kind of your personal identity and your contribution and purpose in the world. So the loss of that, there is a sense in which that is a threat, that is a harm to your personal identity. So one of the other problems is that we don't have a societal structure that allows for someone to kind of comfortably adjust to that or deal with that very often, right? There aren't like mechanisms of justice in place or mechanisms of, I guess what would you call it, like social adaptation or something along those lines that would allow people to better transition from the loss of those things in such a way where it's like, listen, no, this isn't just simply a harm that is done to you personally as an attack so that person experiences some sort of threat, like it's an enemy coming in that they have to resist and fight, or that if it does end up happening, then they feel like there needs to be some sort of justice on their end to get back, like a retributive sense. And the problem is I think we need to be able to figure out how do we actually put those mechanisms in place to allow for people to better adjust to those things that do seem to be threats prima facie, but that ultimately aren't, that they might actually have some sort of, like you said, constitutive benefit at the back end.
Yeah, I think this is something that Cohen actually has kind of addressed, at least at the sort of maybe theoretical level, if not the practical level, so much in this chapter, even though I think he does try to get to the practical here. He said in a previous chapter that his mantra was that the personal is the political. And
Right.
we've heard that before, but his version of it is sort of the kind of contra-Rawlsian version, right? One of Rawls' main ideas, and especially the way that's sort of applied in practice when it comes to governments and the attempt to form some sort of like justification for certain kinds of policy, is to say that there's some sense in which we can get into this original position where we can get rid of all the personal characteristics that we have, and then abstract from there to what would be the most fair form of society, right? And now Rawls is comfortable with having sort of empirical observations about human nature and stuff like that as part of it, but those usually end up being like economic rationality and stuff like that. Whereas, you're talking about bringing in psychoanalytic readings here. I think that's really important because if we're going to bring in these observations about human nature, it's also going to involve all the stuff that we've sort of discovered about human beings and psychology in the last 40 years since, Rawls wrote A Theory of Justice. And I think we realize, and this is something Rawls himself even stated in his last book when he sort of reformulated a few things about the theory of justice, that inequality in and of itself is like an evil or is a sort of a bad thing, and creates these externalities which are necessarily going to be bad. And that's something that we have to be comfortable talking about. And most people want to sort of keep politics out of that realm of the personal and make it this purely abstract thing. And that just doesn't seem possible to me. I think we need to be able to talk about the moral and the ethical and the personal, not in a way that's about like, whipping people into shape or talking about super predators or bullshit like that, right? But kind of like the way that AOC and Bernie do it, right? Having these moral and ethical visions based upon what we know about human beings and being comfortable talking about that in a way that is not exclusionary, but can include people that have similar visions.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it'd be fun to talk a little bit more about this and maybe just like a separate podcast about what could the personal is political mean in a different context, in a way that isn't stultifying, in a way that isn't going to simply engage in like self-flagellating moralism or something along those lines.
Do you use plastic straws? Yeah.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And then do you pat yourself on the back because you are such a good progressive because, well, I don't use plastic and I don't have trash, or like my carbon footprint is null, right? Like, why? What is it that allows somebody to circumvent that negative version of the personal is political? Because there seems to be a reason why one would tend towards the bad moralism or the kind of more vulgar individualism than sort of like a productive version of it. And I think I have some ideas as to why, but that would be interesting to kind of really unpack further.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And I think that's really the important thing I'm taking from the end of the Cohen book here is not to make this about, well, should rich people give more money? Which is sort of like I guess it's a much more effective version of the plastic straws, but it's in the same category, right? It's just like the best version of the plastic straws. And take it more about how do we kind of excavate this personal is the political mantra? What does it actually mean? And how do you apply it in such a way that it's actually effective for producing some form of a just society?
Yeah. Okay, so I guess the last thing that Cohen does is he has like a little epilogue at the end here. And you said you had something highlighted that you enjoyed from that.
Yeah, so the basic story of the epilogue here is Cohen's talking about his father, right, in the fabric factory or whatever he was working in. And he tells this story about his dad going off and forming this kind of workplace of like a factory of his own or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that he wasn't able to succeed because he didn't push his workers as hard as sort of the competition does.
Yeah, exactly. It's the typical, like, as much as America likes to try, or American conservatives like to say that small businesses are the backbone of the economy, it's very much actually small businesses get swallowed up because they can't compete just because of economies of scale and access to resources and capital that the big industries can.
And also 95% of all small businesses like fold in the first year. So that would be a pretty terrible backbone for your economy if it fell apart 95% of the time.
But the bankers are happy because they're the ones providing the loans and getting those loans serviced.
Yeah, it's the backbone in a very different way, right?
Exactly.
And I had this little passage here highlighted that Cohen says in his very typical pithy, brief way and concise way. He said the lesson he learned from this was not that his dad was sort of not up for the task or anything like that. But that the capitalist market does not require people to handle people roughly.
Yes.
His father didn't, right? But the boss's manner is not the main point of the story. Its point is that the market does require people to handle people, to manage them in a particular sense. And that really hit me because it got to the root of what I think is unethical about kind of the current form of capitalism, or at least what it does to people, how it affects the social fabric and the social sphere in a way that I think intuitively for pretty much anyone is going to end up being unethical or unjust. And that you treat people like they're not people. You don't actually treat them as if they are human beings who can suffer and who have intentions and who have goals and ends of their own. In the same way you assume you should be treated, or in the same way you treat yourself. And capitalism requires you to do that. That's part of what success would mean. And Cohen's father wasn't up for the task of doing it like that. And I thought it was kind of beautiful that he just took that bigger principle away from his father's experience. And it really kind of makes a beautiful tragedy out of his father's experience as well, which I thought was great.
Yeah, it's funny. I highlighted the exact same part because I think for me too, that's going to be like a common thread in everything that I produce, whether it's podcast content or film content or whether it's books or journal articles or whatever, is I think you'll be able to extract that kernel that that one of the things that I contest about capitalism per se is precisely that notion that it handles people. And I like the use of handling because it's a very tactile term, right? Like managing is almost a little bit too far removed, right? It doesn't quite, but the idea of handling, I mean, I'm literally thinking my hand, like it's putting their hands on somebody. And this,
it's touching. It's very intimate.
Yeah, and it's a very lovely way of describing a very sort of, in a way, a violent process. And yeah, the notion of subjectivity is something that's so important to me. So I then automatically go to thinking about how capitalism handles people is part and parcel of how it actually diminishes their ability to be people, right? Like you can't even be human because capitalism handles you and creates you in its own image. And that to me is the thing that I want to contest, I think, more than anything. And that's why I think to be a humanist is to be anti-capitalist. This is why I've never understood like the sort of like Christian libertarian or kind of free marketeers, where I'm like, but wait a second, don't you believe that we're made in the image of God? And don't you believe that there's a value to humanity? And don't you then simultaneously say, yeah, capitalism isn't good because it kind of like harnesses those basic human tendencies that are the desires that are precisely contrary to the Imago Dei, that are precisely contrary to Christian charity. But nevertheless, you somehow valorize them. Wouldn't you want to mitigate those tendencies, those corrupting tendencies? If it preys on selfishness and if it breeds selfishness and competition and strife, aren't those the very things that the Christian gospel tries to overcome? And you might say, yo, yeah, but that's for like the converted individual soul or whatever. Why can you not broaden that out to the social element and recognize that? And now this is the sort of like paternalistic progressive. We need to sort of like mitigate, if you will, those tendencies. And that's why you impose like the welfare state, because that sort of like suppresses the negative aspects of like a market logic, which I kind of have an issue with the paternalism of it. But nevertheless, it's interesting to note that tension, right? Or the difference, let's say, between the sort of like progressive view, which is no, we need to sort of stifle the market's alienating or competitive tendencies. Whereas so many people are like, no, let's valorize it. But at the same time, especially with like a Christian worldview, the whole notion of kind of creating a society that is one of love and mutuality and, you know, the notions of Christian charity and things like that are completely opposed to it. And I don't know. These are just things that are constantly swirling around in my mind when I listen to people talk.
Back in your theology days, were you a post-millennialist?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, towards the end.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure about that.
Yeah, towards the end, definitely. It was, you know, social gospel stuff, and then Wolfhart Pannenberg and Jürgen Moltmann and Theology of Hope stuff. So, yeah. You?
Yeah, did you ever hear that argument? I'm sure you did back in the days in the church of capitalism is contrary to sort of the kingdom of God in some sense, or like, you know, like Matthew 5, like Sermon on the Mount type ethics and stuff like that. But this is the way we naturally are given original sin, and
Yes.
Capitalism is the most efficient mode of utilizing human nature in that way.
Right.
You heard that argument, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm referring to. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think most Christians think that deeply about like structuring their beliefs and making them consistent, but some do.
Yeah.
And what I always found incredibly baffling about that argument is just that, well, don't you think those things ruin us?
Right. Doesn't that take you
don't
further
those make us
away?
Suffer?
Right. Like
It
if
doesn't
you,
make us happy.
no. Well, and not
What
only
do
that,
you-
but if the Holy Spirit is supposed to be the thing that changes your heart, if you as a Christian have been changed, then wouldn't you be changed away from the desires of the flesh and therefore away from the logic of capital that you just said is preying on the sin nature?
Well, they are in the church, right? But they're talking about the secular state, which they think is always going to be divorced from that, should run in this way. And my problem with that idea, and they'll say the church should be opposite of that, right?
Right.
But that if the secular state works to sort of amplify the worst parts of human nature and the parts that will produce the most suffering and unhappiness, how could you ever want that to be the case? You mean you want to produce more suffering? And it's not like there's some like long long argument about, well, in the long run, that'll bring more people to the church or something, like some weird accelerationism.
I was just thinking, I was like, is this Christian accelerationism?
Yeah, I don't think they make that claim. But
no, they don't.
It just seems so strange. To me, it seems like they're telling on themselves. They're saying, actually, it'd be more fun if I got to do all the shit that I'm not allowed to do. All the sinful shit. It's actually more fun. I'd be more happy that way.
Yeah.
It kind of seems like they're saying, and I don't think that's true. They wouldn't be. But I think it's a little bit of this, I've been, cloistered my whole life and not been able to do the fun stuff. And in a way, I'm going to like repress that. And it's going to come out in this whole, like the secular state should just amplify all the vices that we have naturally.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is. Yeah. Interesting stuff. Well, I really enjoyed going through this book, man. I think one of the things that I appreciated so much, a couple of things. One, I love how he was able to weave the personal and anecdotal into the more general theoretical. I really like that. I think he's an excellent communicator. And it's something that hopefully I can learn. I talked about it in my shitty minute last week, how I'm, perpetually dissatisfied with the things that come out of my mouth. And to see somebody who I can respect as a communicator, and it's always good to kind of engage with somebody who is clear and concise, but at the same time has heart, and I really like that about the book. I feel like maybe he said a couple problems that I wish were tackled a little bit more completely. Like I wish he engaged a little bit more with theology, but I can't criticize him too much for something that isn't necessarily what his intention or his forte is or was.
Yeah, although I do agree with you that there was a sense in which he set that expectation up, and then didn't fulfill it, which is kind of I don't know. I'm not sure how to think about that and why that ended up not being the case, or maybe just missing out on that chapter 7.
And then randomly, I love it. He fucking quotes Matthew. What is it? Matthew 5 as like the very end. What is it? Matthew what that he quotes?
I don't remember.
The very last thing that he does. The way he ends his book. Oh, he quotes Mark 8. This is literally the last sentence of the book. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? So even though he doesn't explicitly engage too much with like textual analysis or anything like that, there is and maybe it's also because he's a philosopher and he knows that if you engage too much with religion and theology, that sort of is viewed skeptically, especially in like analytical philosophy circles, right? Maybe you can see that influence is still there, though. The sort of ethical principles of egalitarian Christianity, particularly the words of Jesus, I think are things that he would be very drawn to, right? I don't think you're going to see him engage much with Paul, but definitely Jesus of the New Testament is a specter that is sort of like haunting everything in this.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you can gain a lot by talking about Paul when it comes to equality.
I think you can.
The guy who said neither Jew nor Greek, right?
Absolutely. I think you can. Most people who engage with the ethical element of the Bible don't seem to think that way.
We know what we need to do, Austin. Is go back in time to like the year 2000 and find G.A. Cohen and give him some new perspective on Paul literature.
That's what I'm saying. That's right. Bringing the world to rights, creating the single people of God. This is the language of Paul. This is the language of the Abrahamic covenant. Oh, Jesus. But yeah, no, it's very good. I appreciate the suggestion. We'll have to make sure that we keep going up and up and up with our book clubs.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about what we are probably going to do for our next book club. I don't want to spoil it yet. We still have to decide. But we have a couple of choices, and I'm really excited about them.
Sweet.
But we have something else we got to do before we sign off on this one.
Oh, what do we have to do?
We got to do the Sticky Leaves, bro.
Oh, yeah.
The Sticky Leaves is where one of us talks about whatever it is that's bringing us meaning in a potentially meaningless universe. So, Austin, what's doing it for you this week?
So my Sticky Leaves is more about you than it is about me in a weird way. You know how you're always the dude that suggests the music? Well, I'm going to recommend some motherfucking music for you people.
Nice.
It hasn't been released yet, but I was a guest on a podcast called Radio 8 Ball. Are you familiar with Radio 8 Ball?
I am not. I've never even heard of that.
So it's pretty cool, actually. It's hosted by Andros Jones. He's an actor, producer. He's had a long career in the entertainment industry, and he's been doing Radio 8 Ball for like 20 fucking years. But he has all kinds of amazing guests come on, and he's like a fan of Wisecracks Show Me the Meaning, and then he started listening to both Owls at Dawn and I Dig This Movie, and he reached out to me and was like, dude, I'd love to have you on as a guest to talk about something. Basically, the way that it works is, remember the Magic 8 Ball that you would like ask it a question, then you would shake it, and then it would give you the answer?
Yeah.
So the way that he does it is he has a musical guest come on, and the musical guest is basically the pop oracle, is what he calls it. And so he'll have a guest like myself come on and ask a question. And ours was themed around the new TV series Star Trek Discovery, at least the first season. It was just before the second season had launched. And it was kind of like in celebration of the second season starting, but like talking about some of the themes and whatnot that are covered in Star Trek Discovery. And then I ask a question, or the guest asks a question to the pop oracle. It could be anything, right? Like, what is the nature of humanity? I think that was something about mine. It was something about like, what does it mean to be human, or something like that, or like, what does the future of the world look like? Something like that. And then he like spins a wheel, and there are like 8 songs from the musical guest, and whatever the spinner lands on, that artist, the musical artist, sings the song, and that song is then the answer to the question. So
wait, who chooses the songs?
It's like a wheel. He like spins a wheel.
So they're pre-chosen?
I think it's something like that. It's like there are 8 songs, or like sometimes like the way they used to do it, they would like put a CD in, and they would just randomly put shuffle, or they would have like, like one of those 50 disc changers or something like that, and he would just push shuffle, and whatever song played, that was the answer to the question. But now he'll do like live in studio musicians, right? But he's had like Phil Elverum was on there. That's your boy.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's got amazing guests, like legit musical guests. Come on.
I gotta check this out.
It's really fucking cool, man. And then he also has amazing like guests come on. Like I was like super privileged because in the same episode, which I think is not released until like March, I think he said, but like the cast from Star Trek Discovery is also in it as well. So Anthony Rapp, who is most famous from Rent and things like that, but he's the guy. He plays like I don't know if you're familiar with the TV show, but he plays Stamets. Who is the mycologist on board. But anyway, and then a couple of the cast members were in it, interviewed as well. But the musical guest is what I really want to talk about. One, check out the podcast because it's kind of amazing. I think it's really kind of a cool vibe. And they're like short, like 20-minute episodes. So they're like super digestible and super fun and kind of short and snappy. I like them.
We wouldn't know anything about that.
What's that?
We wouldn't know anything about that.
No. But the musical guest that I was on is a woman by the name of Alex Lilly, and she released an EP called 2% Milk. And the song that I got when I asked the pop oracle and we spun, the 8 ball or whatever, was 2% Milk was the answer to my question. But the song 2% Milk from the EP 2% Milk is just such a fantastic song. And then I was so compelled after that. I was like, I'm going to immediately download this EP. And I told Alex that, and she was like, oh, thanks. But it's really like an excellent album. It's sort of synth poppy, but not like Churches and upbeat and dancey. It's much more moody. The lyrics are extremely introspective. Like the first song is called Confucius Say, or Confucius Says. And it starts off with her like talking about how she's on her therapist's couch, like spilling her guts out and dealing with like some of those tough discussions that you have when you're trying to do the personal work on yourself. And then the second song is 2% Milk, and it's all about how it's co-written from between her and a poet, where they had like a theme to talk about something, and they the woman I think wrote this poem, and then Alex turned it into a song. But it's all about how life is 2% milk now, and how she's craving something whole, and how there's like everything is sort of like diluted in a way. But it's really fucking wonderful. It's about how she like wants all that was whole, all that was pure. Life is 2% milk now, and it's like these really kind of like lovely poetic lyrics about seeking the wholeness and connection and completeness and whatnot. And then there are like other songs that are a little bit more kind of upbeat and happy. Like this one song, it's called like Distracting Me, and it's like I love it when you are distracting me is the lyric. But it's just a really lovely album, and It kind of fits right in that sweet spot of albums that make me happy, but that also make me think. So Alex Lilly, EP is called 2% Milk. Check it out.
Wait, so what was the question you asked to which that was the answer?
It was about human nature. So, because like
Okay.
in Star Trek Discovery, you know, you have these various different races, right? These various different species. And at the end of season 1, the main character like makes a couple of statements about what it means to be human. And that was my question. I was like, you know, ultimately, what is the nature of human reality? And fucking 2% Milk came on, and I was like, oh shit, that's like synchronicity. And that's
This is like a fun version of astrology.
you know, and this is the thing. So Andres Jones is really the guy that hosts it. He's really into the notion of synchronicity, right? And so that's kind of like his thing. Is he thinks we could call it maybe intertextuality, even, right? But he really likes the idea of how it is that like these different forces come together, and that you can have a productive and stimulating conversation where you take two things that might be disparate and they might not seem to be related, but you can relate them if you do a little bit of productive work. So, yeah.
That sounds really cool. I'm going to definitely check that out. When has your episode already dropped?
No, I think like March. Yeah, it's March. Okay. He said. So it's like he does it like seasons. I don't think it's like an every week sort of thing. It's like season 1, season 2, or I think that's how it works. And he's always releasing like back catalog episodes, so there's fresh stuff because he's literally been doing it for like 20 years.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I mean he has maybe not 20 years, but like 15 years. It goes back to like 2005 and shit like that. And he'll release like a new episode with, you know, some well-known indie artist or something like that. You dig it too. A lot of the artists are going to be people that you're going to be like, oh fuck, are you kidding me? So
yeah, it sounds great. I'm definitely going to check that out.
Yeah.
All right, so we got anything else to talk about?
I think that's pretty much it, man. Yeah. So for people out there that enjoyed what we're doing, feel free to follow us on Twitter so you can get some more updates on some like new episodes and when we're deciding on what we're going to do for our next book club or whatever. It's owls_at_dawn. You can find us on Facebook. If you have any questions, you can email us, owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. What else, Troy?
You can check us out at owlsatdawn.com.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to leave comments for the episode. And do remember that if you leave us a 5-star rating and review on iTunes and ask a question, we will ask your question and name drop you on the air. So be sure to do that.
Sweet. And just for you basketball heads out there, if Anthony Davis does get traded to the Lakers, then we might have an Owls After Dark episode talking about basketball. So
the entire thing will be me just running through my house naked, shoving various delicious foodstuffs into my mouth and screaming.
That sounds good.
And I'll also have unibrow by that time.
Oh, dude, that's going to be amazing. LA is going to be overtaken by unibrow. Of course, I don't think it's going to happen at the trade deadline from what it seems like. So we'll just have to wait until the off season.
I hope that the Hollywood sign will have like a giant unibrow over it. That would be great.
That'll be his welcome to LA.
Jack Nicholson will have a unibrow.
Oh, that's amazing. All right, cool, man. Well, is there anything else we got to say?
Just one more thing, dude.
What's that, man?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.